Now, to set the ball rolling, issues of transitional justice. These are things that are right in our heart. And currently there are global discussions around how do we deal with the issues, the legacies of violent conflicts. You know very well that the Great Lakes region of Africa has had a lot of conflicts. Not only the Great Lakes, conflicts are throughout the world. In history, a historiography of conflict in Africa will reveal a lot of conflicts. But the main question is, how do societies transform from their states of dealing with some of these horrendous issues to transiting to have a more durable, developmental, and democratic states? And since, just to be fair, since the ambassador of Germany in Uganda is the one who is physically here, I want to give him the latitude to tell us about transitional justice.
Transitional justice is on the international agenda in post-conflict and post-repression settings. The tasks of promoting justice, compensation, and reconciliation after conflict are challenging and can take many years to achieve. Systemic abuses of human rights that are not adequately addressed are a source of social unrest and often contribute to renewed violence. Truth-seeking initiatives, therefore, can play a powerful role in documenting and acknowledging human rights violations. Memorialization is an often neglected aspect in the consolidation of transitional justice. Memory initiatives also contribute to the public understanding of past abuses. In the aftermath of a devastating conflict or repressive regime, for example, knowing the truth about the past is more than just an important step toward justice. It is a recognized human right to which all victims and survivors of armed conflict and repression are entitled. In 2021, Dominic Ongwen was found guilty before the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity. His trial marked the first ICC case in which an indictee was charged with the same crimes as those done to him, and it once again raised important questions for post-conflict recovery. How do states and their people move forward from conflict while respecting the needs of victims of conflict for justice? Questions of amnesty have arisen in global peace negotiations as mediators try to balance the immediate need to diffuse actors with the long-term needs of societies and people for justice. So, who has the power to make these decisions, and what role do international stakeholders play? In a world where women are often left out of peace negotiations, how do we ensure their rights are protected? And finally, are men looking for peace while women are still waiting for justice?
Germany, you know very well, is a country that has also had their fair share of conflicts. You know very well, when we talk about Germany, you hear about the Nuremberg trials, which brought us the Nuremberg paradigm of transitional justice, and many others. But the beauty about this country called Germany, even in spite of all these conflicts they've been through, is a democratic giant in the Western Hemisphere, or by parity of reasoning, the whole country. So what is the trick that Germany did to overcome all these dictatorships and human rights violations to become the present democratic and economic miracle? Your Excellency, you're welcome to take us through.
Thank you so much. Musibye Mutia Mwebale Okunshaza. Thank
Webale,
you
webale
for
nyo.
hosting me. Last night, November 9th, 83 years ago, the Nazis in Germany burnt down synagogues, vandalized Jewish graveyards and shops, started killing and deporting their fellow citizens of Jewish faith. This was the beginning of the immeasurable suffering that the Nazis brought over Europe and the whole world. The Holocaust is an absolutely singular occurrence and cannot be compared to any other genocide. Please don't misunderstand me that I'm trying to make comparisons. Unfortunately, in all parts of the world, there have been examples of great suffering systematically inflicted upon compatriots in all continents. South America, Africa, Asia, you will find examples. So the question is often asked, why don't people stand in for their neighbors and put an end to this sort of ludicrous discrimination and violence? I think the answer is twofold. It's partly in human nature, because we all have the potential for evil within us, and it starts with our selfishness. And it's partly in the circumstances. If you live in a regime that is currently slaughtering part of its population, the average person doesn't really want to get into the line of fire and risk their own life, the life of their families and friends. So these things happen time and again, and the question is, once the atrocities have ended, where do we go from here? The first gut instinct, I think, that many people have is to just try and forget about it. Move on, start with normal lives again. I personally don't know of one single example where that has worked. Though it's extremely unpleasant and inconvenient to acknowledge the evil that has been done cannot be erased. It's among us, it's here to stay, and we have to deal with it. So, there are quite a few examples of how people came to arrange themselves with the facts on the ground. The first step is usually to acknowledge the facts. This can be extremely painful, both for the victims and the perpetrators, but honesty and truthfulness is an absolute essential element. If you try to sweep parts of what happened under the carpet, you are adding insult to injury. And the victims will rightly feel that they are not being taken seriously, and their wounds and bitterness will only become deeper. So, once the facts have been established, the second question is, of course, how do you deal with them? Restorative justice is what needs to be discussed. The punishment of the offenders and, if possible, compensation for the victims is what legal systems provide for. And after World War II, quite a few Nazis responsible for the Holocaust were sentenced by the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal, as you already mentioned. This was absolutely necessary as an answer to this long and systematic genocide of the Nazis. However, in South Africa, it was a very different situation, and Nelson Mandela chose a different way. He did not put the politicians from the apartheid regime on trial, though they would have deserved it. He probably acted this way not because only to avoid a civil war, but because he firmly believed in reconciliation instead of retribution. And I deeply admire him for this, for having chosen forgiveness over punishment. And he was entitled to do so after having spent 27 long years in prison himself. He initiated the Truth and Reconciliation Committees. There again, the truth factor, important. Because without truth as a basis, reconciliation is not possible. And the truth must be made public, not behind closed doors. Offenders must own up to their crimes. The third and longest phase is reconciliation. This can only get started if both sides are willing to engage, and that is not always the case. And reconciliation is nothing that can be decided by authorities. It is a personal matter, not visible to the outside, a process in which a victim freely comes to the decision to give up ideas of retribution and compensation and forgive the offender because the offender is sincerely asking for forgiveness in a way that is acceptable. The state has no power at all to make this happen. It can only set conditions to enable it to happen. For instance, creating these truth and reconciliation committees. The atmosphere must be one without fear of revenge and the fear of crimes being repeated. The truth must be given space to breathe and to live. Depending on the circumstances, remembrance can be an essential element of reconciliation. We have the Holocaust Remembrance Day each January 27th, initiated by the United Nations. I was privileged to actively participate several times in these ceremonies commemorating the Holocaust. These horrific crimes committed by the German Nazis as part of my history as a German and the memory of how the Holocaust and how such barbaric cruelty was even possible needs to be kept alive. It needs urgently to be kept alive. Forgetting is not an option. And also as an example of what must never, ever happen again. Some people say, come on, it's been how many decades, how many generations? Let's just forget about this. I could say, I was born 25 years, a quarter of a century after the end of the war. But it doesn't concern me. But this is absolutely wrong. It does concern me. Such immense suffering is always passed on to the next generation and often to the generation after that. So it is out of respect for the victims that the children and grandchildren of the perpetrators should not brush aside what their ancestors did, but must endure the shame and embarrassment that comes with the crimes of their ancestors. You can believe me as a German, when I meet Jews, especially old ones, maybe they actually suffered from the Nazis themselves, or middle-aged ones, or young ones, they will say, yes, my aunt, my father, my brother, my cousin, they were killed by the Nazis. I don't have an answer to that. I can only say, yes, that was a very brutal crime, and there's no excuse and no justification for it. But as the moderator mentioned, we came to terms with it. We had the Nuremberg trials, but the legal side is part of the equation. And I would say in some cases essential, in some cases not, but the bigger part of the equation is psychological, that people come to accept that these crimes are part of what their ancestors, what their government did, and own up to it and see how can we move on, how can we make it up. Of course you can't make it undone, but facing it and dealing with it in a humble and honest way, I think is the only way forward.
Okay, thank you, Webalenyo, His Excellency Matthias Schauer, for that elaborate discussion, especially touching on the German experience. I think you've answered a very fundamental question here, because people say, why memory? Why do we need to remember? Remembrance and memory, not its antithesis, forgetting. And here I think he has answered it very well, that the victims need closure, and also as part of our social relations, it is important that we need to get over these things, and closure can only be achieved through acknowledgement, which I think it is very important to underline from his presentation in this discussion. I'm going to invite Honorable Bigombe to give us a unique perspective regarding gender justice or gender in conflict. You know very well, women throughout the world have played a very important role in peace building. I told you the Honorable herself was in the jungles meeting Joseph Kony, talking peace. And also elsewhere, like in America, like in Argentina, You've had women, mothers coming out, forming associations called Mothers of the Disappeared, seeking for justice for their children. So I think Honorable Bigombe would really, will have to really enrich this discussion and explain to us those particular aspects of gender justice. How can they be dealt with? How can memory be achieved in particularly those legacies of violence which in terms of gender are even more complex, including issues like, if you do a survey of cases in the ICC, you'll find that rape, conjugal slavery dominate. So how do we get justice, compensation, restitution for this, and how can we deal with it in terms of memory? Honorable, you're welcome to take us on that particular aspect.
Well, thank you very much. Initially, when we discussed, we thought we could bring in the Ongwen's case in the ICC.
Yes, please.
But that's
Actually,
fine if,
that is also important.
If we're not going to discuss Ongwen anymore, or we could talk
no,
about
we
it
are actually going to
later.
discuss that also. It's
But
a very important
I think
aspect.
His Excellency, the Ambassador, covered what transitional justice is and the importance of it extremely well. And all I want to add in here is that there can be no sustainable peace without transitional justice. There can be no reconciliation, true reconciliation, without transitional justice. Even the war in the north, victims are scarred today. Some people, when you talk about move on, there's somebody out there who has been raped. First of all, that violation alone is extremely painful. When I talk to some of the women, they say, you know, it's not something that you get over easily, or never at all, because that's what you think about before you go to bed. That's what you think about when you wake up. And then to make it worse, in the case of LRA, and by the way, I participated in the Colombian peace talks as well. In the case of LRA, then they were sex slaves, and they produced children out of that rape. And a lot of them say, sometimes some of them would ask me whether they would tell their children that you're the son or daughter of that killer. And some mothers went on to say, yes, you're a son of Joseph Kony, for example. You're a product of rape, and the child becomes violent because that means you did not want me. But this woman is saying it out of pains. And many of them also told me that, and I've been in Liberia, I've been to Sierra Leone to handle some of these cases. And some of them, if somebody talks about, why don't you just forget it? They think they're not understood. The outcome of rape in sexual violence in northern Uganda, we carried out some survey, and we find 13% of them were very suicidal. About 11% had mental problem as a result of this. So we need to go into the depth of a woman feels when she has been violated. I visited Arusha during the Rwanda Tribunal, and there was this woman, a peasant, who was brought from Rwanda to Arusha to testify before the court. And I could see this woman, she had never been on a plane before, and these judges, the way they're dressed, she was totally intimidated. And of course, the defense lawyer was the best that money could buy, and he was pacing up and down and asking her details of how she was raped, which was bringing back everything. She froze. And she told me later, she said, to make it worse, I had eye contact with the man who raped me and killed my husband. So I was tortured. Why was I exposed to this? And at that point in time, I said, well, in such cases, we need women judges because they would be able to understand better the feeling of a woman who has been violated. Now, going back to child mothers, as we usually refer to them, some of them told me that they unleash their pains and anger on some of these children because they don't know where the fathers came from. They have no connection with the relatives of these children. And therefore, they're lost of how to deal with the children, how to bring them up properly. Because even in schools, rumors go around. And some of them would come and say, well, you know, I was told I'm a daughter to so-and-so. Is that true? So when they come to me and tell me, ask me for advice, whether they should tell them the truth, my simple answer is always, they must know the truth. They must know it's not their fault. They must know, you know, the circumstances under which it happened. But it's also not very good without counseling them after they've been informed about it. And the same thing should happen to the children in school, to understand how to deal with such children. Because when they get to know, oftentimes the studies that we carried out at the World Bank at one time found out that a lot of them are psychologically affected. And it's usually very difficult to get them to pay attention in class. And oftentimes they want to draw attention, they want attention. Sometimes they feel when other children are playing, laughing, they think maybe they're laughing at us because we happen to be children of perpetrators of violence. So to tell you the truth, these women are deeply scarred, and it's nothing like just move on. Okay, some of them have found husbands in the process. But when these husbands are brutal or don't have proper understanding and sometimes insult them or even physically, or they become physical, it straight takes them back to that life they lived during the war and when they were sex slaves. And so a lot of them, even if they get husbands, oftentimes the marriage do not last very long because it brings back that memory when they get husbands or partners who are violent, who do not understand what they've gone through, and sometimes they even say, no wonder you were raped. No wonder you were a soldier, that's why you're rough. So again, I would say it's very, very difficult, and it's a long, slow process for women who have been violated to pick up the pieces of their lives. And mark you, when I'm talking of this, in northern Uganda, I saw it in Sierra Leone too, girls who were 12 years old had been made pregnant. They became child mothers. Their bodies, of course, were not even ready to carry babies, although they had reached that puberty.
Okay, Honorable.
So,
Honorable, I also, before
the treatment is the psychosocial support.
Yes, psychosocial support. Honorable, I also want you to address this new problem in international justice, because the trial of Dominic Ongwen brought in a hybrid perpetrator called the victim perpetrator. And you know that in that trial, international attention is greatly divided. How do you deal with such a new perpetrator? So in terms of bridging this gap, how do we towards a more coherent process policy of dealing with such a new perpetrator. So what would you recommend as an expert on fragility and peace?
Right.
Yeah.
Ongwen's case is very complicated. Complicated because it's true, Ongwen was a victim. But at the same time, by the way, I was asked to go as a witness. I declined. I declined because I met Ongwen physically. And the way he conducted himself during the peace talks of 2004, which gave birth to 2006 mediation, but gave birth to the South Sudan mediation.
Yeah.
I met Ongwen with Joseph Kony, I think twice, and he was cruel, he was brutal. Now, yes, he was a victim, but there were also thousands of other victims who managed to defect, escaped, and risked their lives. There were also victims who had been forcefully conscripted, but they were not as violent as Ongwen, Dominic Ongwen was. Now, if you ask a relative, this is where sometimes I want lawyers to go to the ground, talk to somebody in Lapono, where Ongwen commanded an attack in a village, and ask the relatives of the village, of the killed people, to cook them. How would they respond to a situation like that? When indeed, after ICC indicted Joseph Kony and the 5 commanders, because that was at the time I was the main mediator, the chief mediator at the time, and asking people, their fear was, don't jeopardize the peace talk. ICC, please keep away. We want to cut these people into pieces when they fight, if and when they come out. So that was the talk at the time. The point is, and let me tell this short story.
Okay.
There was a young boy who was extremely suicidal.
As we,
He was
after the
brought
story,
to me
then
to
you
help
pause a
him.
bit, I bring in Rita.
The boy had been abducted with his brother by LRA. And halfway in the jungle, as they were running actually, he developed blisters in his feet. And therefore, he asked the commander then if he could remain there. And the commander said, yes, you can remain. But then asked this young man, the younger brother, gave him an axe to kill him. And he didn't. He hit him, and then the commander said, well, if you can't do it properly, we are going to kill you and get somebody to kill him. Then he said, no, I'll do it. He bashed off his brother's head, and he managed to escape eventually, but he was very suicidal. At that time, I was already, the peace talks was ongoing. So they brought him to me, and that commander had also eventually defected. When I got them together, but I didn't want to frighten the commander because my idea was also encouraging defection as much as possible. So the point was, he showed a lot of remorse and said, I wish I could push the clock back, but I was also under order. This helped this boy a little bit. Unfortunately, he had lost all his parents had been killed. He had only one auntie left who was trying to help him. It helped in the sense that I organized counseling for both of them as much as possible. At least he got out of that suicide, but you can say, I can forgive, but I cannot forget what happened to me that particular day. I can forgive him because he was also under order, but I will never forget what he made me do in this world. So we are walking a very thin line when it comes to justice as far as victims are concerned.
Especially
we need
victim
to take into
perpetrators.
consideration how they feel.
Yeah.
And the question, the ambassador talked about memory extremely well, so I'm not going to dwell on that anymore. That they carry with them for a long time, they're scarred people. It's because we don't spend time to listen to their stories. And this is why I say the process is
Yeah.
extremely,
Okay.
it has to be a
Okay, Honorable, I'll still come back to you. Yes, Honorable, I'll still come back to you, but you raise very fundamental questions. When you're dealing with these new hybrid perpetrators, case by case basis, I think that is what you are telling us, because others show remorse, others don't show remorse. So case by case basis, I think underscores what you've been telling. Thank you so much. I'll still get back to you. Let me have Rita, who is also joining us online from Juba. Is Rita on? Yes. Rita, like I told you earlier on, does peace building work in South Sudan, and she's a founder of an organization called EVE South Sudan, EVE South Sudan. Rita, tell us about, Rita, you're welcome on this panel to discuss transitional justice. You're welcome on this panel. We know very well.
Thank you, everybody, for inviting me for this important panel discussion. And I'm really happy to be among the great minds in this panel. So
Yeah,
greetings from Juba.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So I want to talk a little bit of the history of South Sudan, touching briefly, and then delve into what the agreement actually says.
And then Rita, we know currently South Sudan is in the process of making a permanent constitution. And chapter 5 of that constitution is dedicated to transitional justice. So as you give us the history of conflicts in South Sudan, we would also be interested in understanding this special chapter on transitional justice. What are the contents? And then also in terms of, do they deal with issues of post-conflict restitution? How are you going to deal about memory and some of these transitional justice devices? A whole chapter in your constitution is, I think that is something we would be interested in listening. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. So I will talk about chapter 5, but then just to give a quick history, I think most of us know about what happened in South Sudan. But then in our history, there has never been an opportunity to have transitional justice. So you can all imagine a country that has since colonial time evolved through a number of conflicts and is still struggling to break the circle of conflicts. There are a lot of grievances that are unresolved, and some of these grievances actually contribute to the recurring conflicts in South Sudan. For instance, prior to the 2013 conflict that erupted in South Sudan, there were some voices in the country that kept on referring to events that happened in 1991 between Riek Machar and the Denka ethnic group. And these voices kept on saying that these are some of the events that we cannot forget. And some of these sentiments actually came from key leaders in the country, and in one way or another also contributed to the outbreak of conflict in South Sudan in 2013. Why am I saying this? Because we believe that there is conviction that investigation of past history of violations on human rights, including violations by the military or other government forces or by armed oppositions, are crucial for sustainable peace if they are handled correctly. Of course, I'm sure you have discussed evidences from around the world and the region where transitional justice have actually helped countries move forward. Examples are Rwanda, South Africa, Kenya, among others. I have just concluded a workshop on transitional justice with a number of women parliamentarians. And when the women ask about, or when we ask the question about what period should transitional justice cover, Because in our history, we never had this instrument of transitional justice. A number of women say that we should date back to 1955 to current, and others say we should date back to 1983 to current, meaning that it is important for us all to go back in time and start the process of healing from there. So within the framework of the revitalized peace agreement for the resolution of conflict in South Sudan, the agreement actually provided for transitional justice, which is chapter 5. It is the transitional justice, accountability, reconciliation, and healing. And this chapter calls for establishment of 3 important transitional justice institutions. The first one is the Commission of Truth, Reconciliation, and Healing, and the independent hybrid judicial body, which is to be known as the Hybrid Court of South Sudan. And the third one is the Compensation and Reparation Authorities. These are the 3 transitional justice institutions that are established by the RRCs, which is the Agreement on the Resolution of the Conflict in South Sudan. However, if we look at how it is progressing, we are in month 19 into the transition period. But up to now, very little progress has been done or has been made in terms of implementation of Chapter 5 of the agreement. And I can say, being in this space for a long time, there is very little appetite, in fact, for the implementation of this chapter particularly. So in terms of the hybrid court in South Sudan, it is actually a gray area, less discussion, because I think people have a lot of perspective or ideas about why this hybrid court is being in the agreement, and it's targeting certain people. And also there is these 2 schools of thought around the hybrid court, whether it is justice first or peace, or whether it is peace first and justice later. So there is this discussion, and not a lot has really been said about the hybrid court. But interestingly, it is the Commission of Truth, Healing, and Reconciliation. In Article 5.2.1.1 of the agreement, it directs the establishment of this commission as a critical part of peace building process in South Sudan, and it is to spearhead efforts to address the legacy of conflict, promote peace, national reconciliation, and healing, which for us, we think it is very important, and it can build confidence for people now to talk about the other transitional justice institutions. However, we are also aware that the issue of truth and reconciliation goes hand in hand with many other factors, and it can also generate so many difficult questions. And this includes who needs to be reconciled with who should initiate the process, who should facilitate this process, how should it look like, how do national and international movement provide support to this process, and a lot of other questions that is being generated.
Yes, we still have another panelist who is joining us, Professor Mamdani. Yeah, I think is...
Hello?
Yes, Rita. Yes, Rita, we can hear you. Okay, I'll get back to Rita later. Let me first come back to the ambassador here with us, His Excellency Matthias Shawa. You've had experiences from northern Uganda, experiences of South Sudan, and I think this fits well within your earlier discussion about the South African model of transitional justice and then the Nuremberg model. But what is coming out from this discussion is that Africa is really trying to see how best they can overcome the past. There's the question of also restorative justice that you brought in. If we can also pick up from your experience, are there some traditional justice mechanisms that perhaps may have worked in your country Because I was here when Ongwen was being tried in the ICC said, declined to reduce the sentence of Ongwen based on the pleas made on traditional justice, which again brings back a debate of the incompatibility of African traditional mechanisms and also some of these models of justice. So how would you advise, because you've really been in some of these complex discussions and complex debate, how can we go about these new geopolitical realities relating to transitional justice?
It's a very broad and difficult question you're asking. For me, one criteria for differentiation is if it is clear that certain individuals have committed specific crimes, then they must be brought to justice. Otherwise, you send the signal, oh, well, it happened, but let's move on. This is, I mean, in legal studies, one clear principle: if you do not sanction certain behaviors, then they will serve as an example for others. If, however, it is a very large part of the population that was involved, looking at Rwanda, for instance, I think it's very difficult to go case by case. I'm not that familiar with what happened in the aftermath of the genocide there, but I've participated in several commemoration events, and what the Honorable Bigombe said, I think, is essential. The victims must have a voice. They must feel we are being heard. Our pain is something that we can share. The world is not just shrugging it off and not just moving on, but I think every situation needs very specific mechanisms to deal with the crimes that have been committed. But the underlying feeling, I think, is universal. Whether you're in Africa or in Europe or in Asia or South America, people who have been wronged, people who have been victims, who have been tortured, degraded, their relatives killed, you must give them space. You must deal with this in an open and transparent way and make it clear that we will do everything in our power to prevent this from reoccurring.
Okay, thank you very much. I think the underlying word there is those who have wronged should actually face accountability. That is very critical. But however, some of the, like he emphasizes, some of these mechanisms should also be considered context by context. Like traditional justice has worked in northern Uganda, for example. So I think the question of universality of transitional justice is a key question, because the common denominator here is the human person, regardless of race, regardless of ethnicity. All the underlying denominator is all can be victims of violence.
Human dignity.
Yes, human dignity. So universality, I think that underscores very well the aspect of universality of transitional justice mechanisms. I want to, let's get back to Honorable Bigombe. Honorable Bigombe, yes, Honorable. Yes, Honorable Bigombe, we also wanted you to give a comment on the present issue of, because we were saying that in the ICC, the lawyers for Dominic Ongwen, their plea and allocutors to reduce the sentence of Ongwen was based on pleas of traditional justice, that Ongwen should be given a smaller sentence so that he can go and also undergo the traditional justice process, which the court did not agree with that idea. So, as people within the transitional justice fraternity, how can we bridge this gap of our local peace-building mechanisms like traditional justice, and also vis-a-vis the demand of accountability, which is a principle of law and justice.
I couldn't hear you. There were lots of interruptions when you were talking, but I think I got the gist of the question.
Okay.
One thing is, I think there was a lot of romanticization about the traditional justice. One, when it was practiced in the past, well, first of all, it has never been documented. And so, personally, I tried. I went to Makerere, I went to all places to see whether there was something that had been documented about it. Two, when it was practiced, it was not over killing of this magnitude, because this was close to almost genocide. So it was about one family or a clan. One clan negotiates with the other one. It's about admission that yes, killing took place, killing or whatever crime that was committed. It was also about reparation, that the perpetrating clan would compensate the victim's clan. But a matter of this magnitude, it was too much to subject it to the traditional system of justice. Now, the other thing was that it also did not include women, and yet women were the main victims of the conflict. It does not include youth, although they did try, as they were trying to put it, to make the case that it could be practiced, that it could work. But at the time, the timing of it, there was a lot of emotions. People were divided on the issue because they thought it would undermine the peace talk that was going on. People were desperate for peace. Therefore, anything that appeared to jeopardize it, they did not want it. And therefore, they came up with all this that was made up very, very quickly. I tried very hard to find any elder in the entire Chule region who had participated, who was familiar with the practices. And it was always, I also heard from somebody. I was also told by somebody. So, coming now to your question, is that I participated a bit in the Angola peace process, but mainly it was, at the time I went, it was about DDR, demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration. But there was kind of hybrid in the sense that the traditional practices took place, but they also did not neglect what we call the Western concept of justice. So it was a hybrid, and eventually it worked, like most countries that would, according to World Bank, 1/3 of countries that have been in conflict, 5 years later, or within 10 years, they would have drifted back into war. Yes, there are some problems, but that major conflict, which tore Angola apart, I think it is a practice that could be emulated elsewhere. And the same thing, I wanted to understand Gacaca in Rwanda, how it worked. I cannot say it was successful because at the end of it all, it was not well resourced, not well funded. And also people just got tired of leaving their homes in the morning when you have competing needs, you need meals for the day, children have to go to school. So eventually kind of dissipated. So it's very difficult to
Honorable,
well, it worked to some extent. I would say,
Honorable, can you hold a bit so that I also get in Professor Mamdani? I'll also come back to you if you can hold it exactly there. So let's get Professor Mamdani. Yes, Professor Mahmoud Mamdani. like I told you, is the Dean. Yes, Professor, you're welcome to this panel on transitional justice. You're welcome, and I am actually going to give you, to cast the net wide by just giving you a chance to address us on your thoughts in general regarding transitional justice and the questions of memory and generally, without limiting you to the Nuremberg and the South African paradigm.
Thank you very much, Chair. Well, I've been thinking of this question of extreme violence, societies which experience extreme violence, and the efficacy of transitional justice as an antidote. And I've basically arrived at a conclusion very critical of the methodology known as transitional justice. And I'll try and explain my reasons for it. The methodology of transitional justice is based on the criminal justice model in the US. And the model has huge shortcomings. First of all, crime is understood as an individual act. And the solution is individual punishment in the courts. According to this model, the state cannot commit a crime because crime by definition is violation of law of the state. Only individual agents of the state can commit a crime. The ICC has never charged the state. Even when it has charged presidents, it has charged them not as heads of state, but as individuals. The foundation of this mode of thinking, the globalization of the American fetish with criminal justice, the American fetish is under severe questioning in the US itself now, with Black Lives Matter, with the movement that questions whether forces of the state like police should have immunity and therefore impunity. The model is under questioning. The model became globalized with Nuremberg. But Nuremberg was forgotten with the Cold War. At the end of the Cold War, the model was revived. And it became more or less a global technology with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. And the claim that one size fits all. Context doesn't matter. We have a way to do this, and this is how you do it. So let me first talk about Nuremberg, why it failed, and then about the TRC and why it was a fiasco. After the Second World War, there was an American debate on Nazism. Was Germany liberated or occupied? Was Nazism a state project or a social project? Who should be held responsible for Nazism? The nation or the state? Nazi leaders or the German people? The American consensus was that the responsibility for Nazism lay with the German people, considered criminally culpable, though each one individually. Yet Nazism was never probed as a political project. This is the difference between individual prosecution and dealing with a political project as represented by the state. A similar debate unfolded inside Germany, particularly among German left intellectuals, the most prominent being Franz Neumann and Herbert Marcuse. Neumann wrote a book called Behemoth, which dissected National Socialism. His answer, Nazism was neither just a state project, nor a project of German society. Nazism was rather a nation-state project, a project of both the Nazi state and the nation, the folk, to eradicate the presence of national minorities, Jews, Roma, and others, from state territory. From this point of view, Nazism was above all a political project. What was the political project? The political project was to create a pure German nation state. A pure German nation state which would be cleansed of all minorities, Jews, Roma, and so on. That is not just a sum of individual crimes. That in itself exceeds any individual crime. Denazification would thus require an alliance of all anti-Nazi forces, external and internal. The Allies and those sections of German society that had resisted Nazism, but Americans were unwilling to do so. Only the Soviets were willing in the East, but only temporarily, not after the Berlin Uprising. Post-war denazification failed because the Allies shut their eyes to the political project that inspired and propelled Nazism. Nuremberg failed to root out Nazism politically. To understand why, I suggest we distinguish the criminal model, which understands violence as the result of antisocial acts of individual perpetrators. I suggest we distinguish this criminal model from the political model, which sees extreme violence as the result of mobilization of entire groups around a collective nation-state project. Rather than individualize the violence as a standalone act, I suggest we identify cycles of violence sustained by groups mobilized as so many constituencies, even if none of them are perpetrators on the battlefield. Rather than catalog atrocities so as to name, shame, and punish individual perpetrators, I suggest it's better to identify the issues around which constituencies were mobilized. More importantly, rather than exclude perpetrators from the political process, I suggest it is much better to include them along with all those who survived: victims, perpetrators, beneficiaries, bystanders. Let me turn to the example of South Africa to make clear what I mean. In South Africa, you had both a criminal process and a political process. The political process preceded the criminal process. The criminal process was the TRC. Like Nuremberg, it focused on individual violations. But different from Nuremberg, which was about crime and punishment, TRC was about crime without punishment. The political process was CODESA. It focused not on individual perpetrators, but on harm done to large groups of people. It focused not on individual violence, but on state violence. And the purpose was not to punish individuals, but to reform the state. My suggestion is that when it comes to cases of extreme violence, the real problem lies in the nature of the state. And the solution requires reforming the state. Let me explain. Criminal violence excludes perpetrators from the political process. I suggest an opposite solution, including perpetrators in the political process. The anti-apartheid movement in South Africa did not follow, in the main, did not follow the Nuremberg example. The great achievement of the anti-apartheid movement was to understand the violence of apartheid as political and therefore seek a political rather than a criminal solution for it. There was not a single court case, remember that. This was the negotiated end to apartheid that led to the emergence of non-racial democracy. A criminal approach would have sought to separate apartheid's perpetrators from its victims and punish the perpetrators while producing justice for the victims. This would not have furthered the goal of political reform, which is what South Africa badly needed. The creation of a democratic state in which all could participate, regardless of race. Instead, by taking a political approach, South Africans reconfigured perpetrators and victims alongside beneficiaries and bystanders as something altogether new, survivors. All groups were survivors of apartheid with a place at the negotiating table after its violence.
Yeah, okay.
The political model acknowledges.
Yes, Prof. Yeah, Prof, I think we are running short on time, but I'll give you chance to conclude that particular point you're making. Yes.
25-minute statement, which is what I did. Yeah. But if you say that that we've run out of time.
No, at the end of it all, you'll have a total of 25 minutes, Prof.
The criminal model and the political model. The criminal model feeds a cycle of revenge. It ignores the fact that there are no permanent perpetrators and there are no permanent victims. It ignores the fact that with cycles of revenge, victims become perpetrators, perpetrators become victims. It ignores the fact that the ultimate objective is not partition, is not separate states for perpetrators and victims, but how to live within the state. If that is the goal, then the attention has to be directed at the nature of the state, not at individual perpetrators. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor. Yeah, this is quite a very serious critique on the Nuremberg model and the Truth and Reconciliation model. Just for avoidance of doubt, to reiterate what Professor was saying, because at some point I think the audio was a bit problematic. Professor actually said that the most important thing, inclusion of perpetrators is very critical. And having transitional justice pegged to nation building or creating a more viable nation state is very important. And he says political processes should actually precede criminal processes, giving the example of South Africa. And he says that, giving the example of South Africa. But maybe the question to Professor would actually be that under the present, even if you critique the present transitional justice mechanisms, others would definitely say that there are over 7 or 8 transitional justice mechanisms, and some of them actually target reform, like the question of institutional reform. Can these institutional reform processes reform present governmental institutions or institutions that cause violence? Is this not captured in that aspect when when dealing with a comprehensive transitional justice, which also includes institutional reform? And also, what, in his opinion, would be the most ideal system of transitional justice, since he has already pointed out some of the weaknesses in our current approaches to transitional justice. Yeah, if I can get Prof on that, then I'll come 2 minutes each to the panelists, and then we round up this panel. Yes, Prof.
Well, you cannot have your cake and eat it too. Institutional reform and individual prosecution cannot go side by side, because the very process of institutional reform requires that you drop individual prosecution cases. Criminal justice has to follow political reform. It cannot precede political reform. It cannot go alongside political reform. That's my point. And the point of institutional reform is not to strengthen the nation state, not at all. It is actually to question the very assumption that the state belongs to a nation. It is to solidify the claim of the state as an institution which enforces rule of law without any group claiming that it is the nation and the state belongs to it. The exclusion, my basic claim, is that extreme violence is a result of group exclusion. And it is the question of group exclusions from the political process that we need to address.
Oh, yeah, yes, thank you very much, Prof. I think that is very clear that the institutional reform in transitional justice is not actually aimed at reforming the nation state. It is actually looking at some of these institutions within the state. So a more bigger agenda that targets the nation state, reforming the nation state, is a very important issue in transitional justice that Professor recommends. I'll give 2 minutes each to our panelists to give us their reflection, and also especially that there are a lot of emerging issues that Professor Mamdani has also brought in, especially in the perspective of the paradigms where they based this particular discussion. Your Excellency, you will be first always since you're physically here.
Thank you very much, Christopher Okedi. I'd like to raise the topic of dignity, finally. Dignity, of course, of the victims that has to be restored, that they have space to speak about their suffering, that the truth is put on the table. But even though it might sound surprising, also the dignity of the perpetrators, because from a Christian point of view, every human has God-given dignity, and no matter what we do, how terrible the crimes we commit, we cannot lose it. Also, from the practical point of view, and there I'm picking up on what Professor Mamdani has said, if you want reconciliation, you need the perpetrators to contribute, to engage. And if you do not treat them in a respectful way as human beings, that is out of the question, and then you will never have reconciliation. So that's my appeal. I've heard here in Uganda also criminals being called rats, pigs, vermin, and this I think is not right from a moral point of view, and it is not helpful from a practical point of view. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Your Excellency. I think all of them agree that what is important is development, dignity, and not vindication. You know, the choice between development and vindication, I think, is what they put it out clearly. Honorable Bigombe? Yes, Honorable Bigombe?
Mute. Well, thank you very much. It was very interesting, actually refreshing, listening to Professor Mamdani. I think we need a lot of time to go into that. Unfortunately, we do not have time. I'm not even going to touch, but I just think he raised some very pertinent issues about transitional justice that needs to be looked into carefully. But what I wanted to say, the two things to conclude my remarks. One is that painfully, transitional justice is not being taken seriously by government. I can only talk in the context of Africa. It's usually neglected, and you'll find that it's NGOs working on them. Think tanks are usually doing research on transitional justice. I think it needs to feature highly in reconstruction, in reconciliation, and all kinds of activities. Right now, it is when an agreement is signed, even in the implementation, I'm happy to see Rita here on this panel, but it's more talked about than implemented. That said, I think this debate has to be taken further, not just debated, but and to ensure that it is implemented, that whether it's government is got to be accountable, and accountable for not implementing transitional justice. I also thought I should need to bring in this other element, one of the tools that can contribute to transitional justice is national dialogue. I think that's a fantastic tool. We had national dialogue actually can be a tool for reconciliation, conflict prevention, conflict resolution, can be used in very many ways. I was made to understand Uganda was good, something was led by religious leaders, that Uganda was going to have one. And I thought it was fantastic, because it's not just the fact that it's inclusive to some extent, because it gives the platform to those who are not heard, who do not have the occasion to talk, who are the masses. I saw what happened. I participated fully in the South Sudan one, and it's heartbreaking because people really talked, and I thought it was not 100% perfect. There's some areas that are gray, that did not give us what we want, but I was very disappointed that eventually government rubbished it and it's not being implemented. But I just thought I should bring that, put it on the table as one of the most important tools for reconciliation and truth-telling, just like the ambassador talked about earlier. Thank you very much again.
Yeah, thank you very much. Those are very critical points. The state should be the primary actor in transitional justice, not civil society. I was reading today Brian Tamuka Kagoro when he was talking about transitional justice, the paradox of alien knowledge, praxis, and narratives. He actually said that there is a danger of creating a civilocracy around transitional justice. And he also now calls transitional justice activities of various civil society as a transitional justice industry. So I think the question of the state, the nation state as a primary actor, is very important. Rita, 2 minutes, let us also get your reflections regarding your earlier presentation, and also in light with emerging issues from the presentation of Professor Mamdani. Rita, yes.
I will agree that such an important topic actually needs more time for people to delve more into details and learn more. In the context of South Sudan, I think we have a lot to learn from the region and globally that can inform the process of truth, reconciliation, and healing in South Sudan. In my country, I think people have different or mixed perception about transitional justice. When you hybrid code, but chapter 5 is very rich in other components, which provides the platform for people to open up, to document experiences, and also to heal, also referring to traditional practices that are available to be incorporated into this process. And I think in our context, there is a need to educate and engage the general public to give sufficient publicity on the work of CTRH so that we encourage people to contribute positively. And this, of course, will help change the negative perception of people and build confidence in the process of truth healing and reconciliation, which in the context of South Sudan is very crucial to break the circles of conflict that are continuously recurring in the country. So yes, for us, it's an important process, and we hope we can really learn from the region and benefit from the lessons learned and experiences. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rita. And finally, Professor Mamdani, just to be fair, I think I am going to give you also the opportunity to be the last to submit on this and also touch on some of the aspects you had not touched in your presentation in about 3 to 5 minutes at most. Then that marks the end of the discussion. Yeah.
I'm happy to reflect on the contributions of my colleagues and happy to see Honorable Betty Bigombe, who is a friend. Normally I call her Betty, but here we are in a formal context. So, Honorable Betty Bigombe, happy to see you. Now, look.
Happy to see you too.
Thank you. Let me put on the table my main difference with the transitional justice model. My main difference is this. The accent cannot be on the individual. It has to be on the state. This is also my main difference with the religious model of reconciliation. It is not about individual morality. It is not about individual culpability. It is not about forgiving the individual. It is about reforming the state. Take the principal organization associated with transitional justice, Human Rights Watch. If you read a Human Rights Watch report on a situation characterized by extreme violence, you will see that context is not important for human rights. Context is limited to a one-page discussion at the beginning of the report. That's it. Most of the report is devoted to naming and shaming individuals and calling for individual accountability. In my view, the whole thing should be turned upside down. Context is crucial because context gives us the nature of the state, the circumstances in which it was born, the groups it privileges, the groups it disprivileges, those it includes, those it excludes, the narrow nature of the exclusive political process, and therefore what kind of reform is necessary. Second thing, my second main problem is that TJ, the criminal justice model, integral to it is impunity for the state. You read the TRC report, 6 volumes, there is nothing about state violence. Now, Betty Bigombe is completely right to talk about national dialogue. I would just say that beyond national dialogue, we need actual negotiations, not just dialogue, not just reconciliation with the government, but a political process aimed at changing the nature of the state. On South Sudan, I have one comment. I was a member of the AU Commission of Inquiry into South Sudan. We spent several years. At the end, we could not agree. And we produced 2 reports. One report by Honorable Obasanjo, and I wrote the other report. And the difference was this. The majority report, the Obasanjo report, called for individual accountability, identifying perpetrators, etc. I wrote a report calling for reform of the state. I think those are the choices we have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mamdani. One size fits all does not work in transitional justice. Context matters. That is very important. And focus should not be on individuals, but the state. I think for me, those are the takeaways I get from Professor Mamdani's critique on the Nuremberg and the Truth Reconciliation model of South Africa. His Excellency Ambassador Shoa also said the most important, the biggest takeaway I get is human dignity is very much important. And he agrees with Prof. Mamdani that dignity of even perpetrators is key. Short of that, you are actually going to be executing what is called a victor's transitional justice. But engagement of all these players are very important. And Honorable Bigombe, thank you so much for the discussion. particularly enriching and telling us that context, case-by-case matters in dealing with these new hybrid perpetrators. And Rita, thank you very much for saying political will is very important in all this transitional justice process, where virtually everyone agrees, including Honorable Bigombe, that the nation state should actually be the primary actor. Issues of transitional justice would really require a lot of time, but really, I beg everyone that let us continue with the discussion on the Twitter space. And CAS, the good thing the country representative, our panelists, the country representative of CAS is also here with us, Anna Riesman, and she has really heard that time is very important. So perhaps next time she'll organize a better conversation on transitional justice with enough time. Thank you, all of you, for all your sacrifices and for attending to us on this panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you.